Good morning from Tokyo. My name is Agnes Suri. I'm the Deputy Head of the Capacity Building and Training Department of the Asian Development Bank Institute, ADBI. Welcome to the fourth episode of our webinar series entitled The Economics of Climate Change. With 1 hour webinars, this series is meant to provide initial knowledge on key issues. It is based on the idea that climate change and the required transition to respond to it adversely affect economies and public finances through diverse transmission channels. In addition, countries have a range of financial instruments and economic tools to respond to the climate emergency. Here, I'm referring to fiscal policies, budgeting process, debt management, financial regulatory frameworks, and so on. These instruments play an important role in promoting climate adaptation, reducing greenhouse gas emissions, and supporting more sustainable and resilient growth. With this knowledge product, we hope to improve general understanding of the economic and financial aspects of climate change, recommend economic and financial solutions useful for policymakers to build resilient and low-carbon economies, and strengthen developing countries' capacities to design climate strategies and align this with national budget processes and investment plans. This fourth episode focuses on economic tools and solutions to stop natural capital degradation. Let me now invite the ADBI Institute Deputy Dean, Sinju Beck, to welcome you and introduce the theme of this episode. Deputy Dean Beck, the floor is yours.
Thank you, and thank you, Agnes. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. It's my great pleasure to open this webinar series, and welcome to episode 4 on the economics of climate change. Today's topic is about natural capital. Natural capital refers to the stocks of environmental assets, including natural resources, ecosystems, and a stable climate, according to the UN. As we know very well, natural capital provides valuable goods and services to society, and is a key component of economic growth. For a long time, natural resources were considered by policymakers and in the economics literature as unlimited resources, which translated to strategic choices and policies that strongly damaged natural resources. But today, it is well understood that natural resources are a finite stock, and that is the reason why we call it natural capital. Natural capital has many functions and provides goods and are often referred to as ecosystem services, which are essential for life, the sustainability of the economy, and our well-being. But because of human activity, natural capital is actually experiencing severe decline, and the world's stock of natural capital is being used faster than it takes to regenerate natural assets. Increasing pressure on natural capital is driven by a range of factors, including agriculture expansion, urbanization, infrastructure development, and poaching. Stopping natural capital degradation is imperative to preserving ecosystem services, which are key for economic development. It is also essential to respond to climate change, as ecosystems also regulate the global climate and provide resilience against climate-related adverse events. Indeed, they sequester and store greenhouse gases and remove pollutant from the atmosphere. They also regulate water flow and serve as buffers against natural disasters, resulting from climate change. Today, we will focus on the available frameworks and instruments available to policymakers so that they can take action to reverse this trend, rebuild natural capital, and support nature-positive investments. Among many others, what are the economic tools, market-based instruments, and solutions available to stop natural capital degradation? What is the global biodiversity framework approved in 2022? What are the nature valuation tools available to policymakers? And what are the nature-based solutions available? These are the questions we'll try to answer today. I wish you a great session. Thank you. Agnes, over to you.
Thank you, Deputy Dean Beck. Now, I'm very happy to introduce our panelists. Let me start with Laura Whitford, who is Director of Conservation Partnerships for the Nature Conservancy's Asia-Pacific region. All the bios are available on our event webpage, but let me highlight the following. Laura, you have over 15 years of experience designing and delivering partnerships, policy and programs focused on climate change adaptation, sustainable natural resource management, and equity, and you worked across the NGO sector and government. Today, you will introduce the work done by the Nature Conservancy, and you will also present the coming Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework and one of its key targets, which is to conserve at least 30% of the Earth by 2030. Laura, thanks for joining us, and the floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Agnes. It's a real pleasure to be here today. Thank you so much for the opportunity. So as Agnes mentioned, I'm the Director of Conservation Partnerships for the Nature Conservancy Asia Pacific, so based in Australia. I lead a regional team focused on policy, public funding, and corporate engagement. And I also manage TNC's relationship with the Asian Development Bank, which I am delighted to report has lots of exciting areas of collaboration. Next slide, please. For those who may not be familiar with the Nature Conservancy, I thought I might just give a little bit of an overview. So we've been around since 1951. So we originally started in the US, but we're now delivering conservation in about 77 countries globally. We're a science-based organization, so we have over 400 scientists on staff, and we have three main global priorities: tackling climate change, protecting oceans, lands, and fresh water, and providing food and water sustainably. Next slide, please. So for those who like the detail, I thought it might be helpful to provide a little bit more detail about our approach. So as I mentioned, we use science to identify the most critical places. So be it for nature-based climate solutions or biodiversity, we then work together in partnership. So partnership with local communities, with Indigenous peoples, governments, others, in order to develop strategies and test projects. And then we monitor, evaluate, learn to see what's not working. And then for what is working, we look to replicate it. And in that way, we're really focused as an organization on delivering systems change and ultimately in driving more resources towards broader climate and biodiversity goals. Next slide, please. So speaking of goals, here are the top line things that TNC is striving towards as an organization by 2030. So you can see these goals are pretty ambitious, and a lot of them are focused on really large scale conservation, so protection or sustainable management. So just to give you sort of a sense of the kind of scale we're talking about here, 650 million hectares of land. Next slide, please. As well as 4 billion hectares of oceans. So you can see we're really talking about quite significant scale here, which is important in the context of what we're talking about today, which is this global challenge that we're facing of how to conserve 30% by 2030. So next slide, please. So coming to that question of how we do that in a way that's both effective and equitable, I think it's important to ground this discussion first in thinking about the why. So as many of you will be aware, we are currently in a major extinction event, and so losing biodiversity, losing species at a rapid rate. When you combine that with the impacts of climate change, studies suggest that this is going to lead to a significant loss, not just in terms of, flora and fauna, but really from an economic perspective, so in terms of economic value. Science tells us, however, that there's a way to avoid the mass extinction crisis, and that's to protect at a minimum 30% of the planet by 2030. And there are other reasons to do that. So firstly, there are studies that suggest that protecting 30% will outweigh the costs of no action, so of not doing that, by as much as 5 to 1. It will create up to 650,000 jobs and support 30 million more jobs in other industries like ecotourism and sustainable fishing. And this one's really key: provide a third of the climate mitigation needed through natural climate solutions. And we can talk a little bit more about some of the synergies with climate work shortly. Next slide, please. So what does 30 by 30 success look like? If we're wanting to protect 30% of the planet, does that kind of suggest we can just set aside one corner of it and call it done? Obviously not. So as you can see here, it's really important that our protection efforts are what we call READY. So representative, effective, durable, and inclusive. And what I mean by that is they need to be ecologically representative. So they need to cut across different ecosystems: terrestrial, freshwater, marine. They need to be effectively managed, and so with the right investments in place in order to achieve long-term outcomes. They also need to be durable, and so that means we've got the right government policies in place, as well as sustainable financing. And last but definitely not least is they need to be both inclusive and equitable. And so that means we're working together in authentic partnerships with local and Indigenous people, across genders, with a real strong focus on equitable distribution of benefits. Next slide, please. So what do we need to do as a global community in order for this to happen? There's really 4 main ingredients, and I'm going to talk just in the short time that we have today about 2 of them. So policy and science. Next slide, please. So first of all, it's wonderful that we have the global policy framework in place to support this protection. Next slide, please. So as many of you will know, the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework was finalised at COP15 in 2022. This included 23 targets for 2030, and you can see one of those here. So target 3, which talks about ensuring and enabling at least 30% of terrestrial, inland water and coastal and marine areas to be conserved and managed through systems of protected areas and other area-based conservation measures. So this is really the what we're looking to do. Next slide, please. Just as important as the what is the how. And so here you can see the parties have agreed that this needs to be done in a way that, as I mentioned before, ecologically representative, well-connected, and equitably governed. So we have this in the text that all of the various parties have agreed to and have now committed to working back at home within their domestic context to deliver. Next slide, please. Now, one mechanism through which the various parties are operationalizing this commitment is through something called NBSAPs, so National Biodiversity Strategies and Action Plans. As part of these, the CBD Article 6 states that parties will develop national targets, concrete actions, policies and programs, as well as conducting national monitoring, reviewing and assessment. Now, it's important to note that as part of the Global Biodiversity Framework, countries are required to update their NBSAPs this year, and this creates an interesting opportunity. Next slide, please. So TNC and many others are working together with various countries to support the updates to these NBSAPs in a number of countries around the world. So TNC, for example, is helping countries with things like spatial planning, policy analysis, resource mobilization, monitoring and indicators. So in a variety of different ways you can see there. Next slide, please. Now, another opportunity that we're conscious of is that while countries need to update their NBSAPs this year, they also need to update their NDCs, or nationally determined contributions under the Paris Agreement, next year. And so while the CBD and UNFCCC processes are often dealt with pretty separately, we see really important opportunities to look for synergies between countries' different biodiversity and climate commitments. So to look a little bit more deeply into this, TNC commissioned a gap analysis last year in order to look at options for synergies across NBSAPs, NDCs, and national adaptation plans in 20 countries worldwide. And the analysis developed concrete recommendations of what countries can do in order to develop strong and mutually supportive climate and biodiversity policies. And so on this slide, you can see a range of areas where synergies were identified, and I'd be very happy to share this report to anybody who's interested to learn more. Next slide, please. Okay, so that's a little bit about the policy settings that underpin 30 by 30 and how we can do it in a way that's ready, R-E-D-I. Now, as I mentioned, another key ingredient is science. And for TNC, as a science-based organisation, this is another area where we're doing a lot of work. So just to give you a few examples, we're working together with various partners to support the use of decision support tools like MarkSAM, which helps decision-making by balancing objectives like biodiversity with other, socioeconomic, cultural, and political realities. We've also worked together with partners to release the document you can see here, the 30 by 30 Best Practice Guide. So this was developed by TNC, IUCN, WCPA, and Equilibrium Research back in 2022, and it identifies the most effective options for delivering the 30 by 30 target. Next slide, please. There's also the 30 by 30 Solutions Toolkit. So this is an online toolbox and again, developed in partnership with a range of partners, including TNC, IUCN, WWF, and others. I won't talk in detail about it today, but it provides a bunch of super helpful information about you know, the what, the where, the how, as well as other considerations that we need to integrate, such as equity. And I think we're going to put the link to that online toolkit in the chat box so people can have a look. Now, the other two ingredients that I referred to, so finance and equity, I don't have a lot of time to talk about today, but I did just want to reinforce that both of those are absolutely vital. And I think it's great that we're going to have a chance to talk a little bit more about that for the rest of the session. So I will leave it there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Laura. Indeed, this 30 by 30 solutions toolkit is critical for all policy makers, I believe. Now we have a good understanding of the general strategic framework and the tools actionable by policymakers to stop natural capital degradation. Let's go a bit further into the technical aspects of nature valuation. I'm delighted to welcome Vic Adamovics, who is Vice Dean and Professor at the University of Alberta, to talk about that. So Vic, your research has focused on the economic valuation of environmental amenities and ecosystem services, as well as the incorporation of environmental values into economic analysis with applications to many areas such as outdoor recreation, health, water quality, air quality, forest, and agriculture. Vic, could you share with us why it is so critical to value nature and how nature can be valued? What are the nature valuation tools available to policymakers? Vic, over to you.
Well, thank you very much. And thank you for the opportunity to be here and to present today. Yes, I'm happy to speak to the issue of the valuation of nature and why and how, maybe some examination of the tools. Let me say I'm an environmental economist, so I will be talking about valuation in a narrow sense of monetary values. I recognize fully that there are a wide range of values, and it's not always possible to value things in economic terms, but I think it's very useful to think about the important economic contribution that nature makes. And Laura's already spoken to this in highlighting some of the key economic contributions that nature makes. And I'll dig into a little bit of the detail about how we might measure those and how we might use those in guiding various policy tools. So why value nature and why do it in monetary units? For me, one of the key items is that valuing nature and its contributions in a metric that's comparable to the costs of those activities, to other alternative investments, I think that's critically important to be able to show to possible investors who are interested in green bonds, who are interested in payments for ecosystem services, what return will they observe? What will this contribution actually make to the people in the local region, as well as the people globally? So part of it is really just using similar metrics, and that's why I have my balancing scale picture on the side there. I think going along with that is evaluating alternative investment decisions. You know, how much do we invest? Where do we invest it? How do we assess who is benefiting from these investments? The distributional equity aspects that Laura also mentioned. How do we determine which key investments to undertake and where to place those investment dollars? I think these values also help us with regulatory analysis. What are the benefits of setting regulations that support nature and support ecosystem services? How can we generate those outcomes through policy design? These types of values measure appreciation or depreciation of natural assets. And natural assets are much like any other of our assets that are so important to human well-being and planetary well-being. Valuing things with monetary terms will help us make those assessments. I think natural values or values for ecosystem services can also tell us what compensation might be associated with a damage or a liability or a damage to one of nature's services. Now, that's not typically what we focus on with developing mechanisms to support natural capital. But those liability frameworks, I think, can be very important as signals to show the scarcity value of nature, and that industries and others that may potentially damage natural capital stocks would be aware of the impacts. And as mentioned already, I think the distributional impacts of these investments are critically important. And monetary valuation helps us track those measurements. Doesn't help us always make exact assessments of how we should determine final outcomes, but at least there's information on who the beneficiaries are. And of course, as I'll show in a second, I think there's new studies showing the importance of ecosystem services and the way that they are increasing in value. Now, I'd like to highlight just a couple of examples because I think it's always fun to talk about specifics. So here's one, and I'm a bit self-serving. I'm choosing a couple that I've been involved in. This is the Panama Canal watershed. And the natural assets we're thinking of here are the forests and the grasslands in the watershed and the conservation of those forests and grasslands, and in fact, restoration of them, where the primary value arising from this was actually water in the Panama Canal itself and maintaining the service flow associated with transport. Incredibly important economic assets. And the work that was done here was to evaluate what those benefits would be, the scale of investment in monetary terms required to generate those investments, and even to the extent of where they might be best invested in a spatial sense, a targeting sense, or as a way to generate equity within the local regions. So spatially explicit identification of values, the beneficiaries, how to generate those outcomes. That was part of the goal of the study. Very tangible in terms of its benefits and costs. And then you could link that to PES financing schemes, to public-private partnerships, to development of investment strategies like green bonds could all be used as other policy tools to achieve these kinds of outcomes once the evidence or the data shows the value of those investments. This is a different study that was using a natural capital approach that focused on the dynamics and examined something called conservation debt. And here the notion was working around a threatened species and the fact that a threatened species may not contribute directly to a particular economic process, but they are tied to the economic well-being and the economic activities in a region. In this particular study, we were finding that the value of restoration of habitats for a threatened species would actually contribute to reducing a significant conservation debt that arose because of impacts to those habitats in monetary terms as a way to identify the fact that if action wasn't taken, that debt would be passed on to future generations. And again, we can think about debt and financing tools within the context of these types of studies. This is my example of the importance of thinking of valuation in the context of liability. This is the Deepwater Horizon case. What was the economic value of the damage that arose from the Deepwater Horizon oil spill? Significant monetary measure arose from that research. Again, it's partly the framework, though, that's more important, that the value signals the importance of these assets in their natural state and signals that if they're damaged, there is a considerable economic loss. A liability framework that describes the penalties, for example, to responsible parties if these damages occur, I think sets a very strong economic incentive to protect nature and to protect nature where it's valuable. And the last two items I'll highlight are this recent paper that just came out 2 weeks ago in Science that illustrates the increasing benefits from scarce ecosystems that we should expect for a variety of reasons, that ecosystem service values will increase over time. And that when we are doing our valuation, we need to think about that trajectory and the way it will increase over time relative to other values for material goods and services. Again, that's part of the calculus in making investment decisions and planning the trajectory for the investments that we make. And lastly, some very interesting work by Dr. Amy Ando on thinking about valuation and its importance in equity and equitable distributions of the benefits of nature services. Again, by doing the background research, we have ways to measure the impacts on different people and different groups. So how do we do this? Well, a lot of it is kind of detective work. We'll look for the connection between nature and ecosystem services and markets in many cases. We know that natural services are connected to agriculture and fisheries and forestry and tourism. connected to the generation of greenhouse gases, which are now increasingly expressed in market value terms. So how do we make those linkages and identify those values? It's again part of the economic science, if you wish. What's a little more challenging is the impact on non-market goods and services. So these would be the threatened species, for example, or air quality or water quality, things that are not traded in markets. And those can be calculated by observing behavior, and I'll show some examples in a minute. Or in some cases, when behavior isn't observed, we have other methods, natural capital methods or stated preference methods, to try to understand what those values are. And finally, we have databases of values from around the world that are being collected in various databases. Those can be used to inform similar jurisdictions of what the values of their various natural services might be and how they could use those for calculations or for policy analysis. Digging a little bit deeper into the non-market goods and services or assets, what are the types of impacts or the mechanisms where we might see this relationship between environment and behavior? Well, in one case, it's issues like travel associated with tourism. There are studies that suggest that tourism is about 10% of global GDP. And tourism, of course, is often associated with natural assets, and depreciation of those assets would affect tourism outcomes and the economics of tourist locations. There are a whole host of other economic values that we could measure by observing travel behavior, or by observing property choices, that the value of property is associated with the surrounding environmental quality, or labor market choices are associated with environmental amenities. And in some cases, we can measure averting behavior. What are expenditures that people make to try to avoid environmental harms or to reduce adverse environmental impacts? And in certain cases, when other metrics are not available, we may measure replacement costs that in some very specific cases could be a way to characterize what the value of a particular ecosystem service is. And as I've mentioned, we can also use highly structured surveys to examine things when we don't have behavioral trails, or we can transfer values from other regions or locations. So in the last couple of minutes, let me just highlight what this might look like in practice. What we typically think of as an investment strategy or some type of financing strategy. What change in the ecosystem would occur? What change are we thinking might arise from these investments in natural capital? What is the link between those and economic output, human health, other types of values that humans enjoy? How do we measure those? And how do we capture those preferences and values to eventually construct what the aggregate value of that economic activity is? And this is a linear thinking in a way. It's much more complicated than this. And we can introduce transfers, measures of what other regions have done if we're missing values in a particular region. But we have ways to try to characterize that entire thread. And of course, it's also highly interdisciplinary. And I think that's where science is really moving these days, is to work across disciplines to understand the connections between natural capital and people, and then how people affect natural capital. I'm a practical person. I like to get involved in these studies and get my hands dirty with them. And I think that's also important, is to think first about scoping. What are the key markets or behaviors or values that would be affected by investments? What are the key ones that are at risk that we feel really need to be examined, and start to identify the primary data, or perhaps use benefits transfer to make those kinds of trajectories and assessments. I think what's really happening over the last decade, though, is we've seen increasing data availability. We have a whole range of new data sources, whether it be citizen science sources or information from cell phone pings to identify people enjoying nature, or a variety of things that we now have available to us, and a variety of modeling tools to characterize the link between people and natural assets. And of course, we have new modeling approaches, the applications of machine learning and artificial intelligence to examine these data sources, to examine how nature is changing in response to economic activity, and how investments in nature will generate economic returns. So I really see this as an exciting time in thinking about the connections between nature and the economy. So let me wrap up and just say, I think this is a very important area And the measurement, while at times technical, I think it's very important for us to put nature on the same footing and evaluate it relative to other investments that individuals may make, and just to show the importance of nature as a valid source of investment, as an important piece of the economy. I think that improves decision-making and will enhance well-being. As I've mentioned, it will also help us address distributional concerns and will help us assess these depreciations, if there are any, and avoid these situations of conservation debt. And finally, recognizing that those natural capital values are increasing over time, I think it becomes increasingly important for us to capture them and to include them in our decisions. And I'll leave you with some photos of some of my favorite forms of natural capital. Sure, these lovely hummingbirds from various places around the world. Thank you again for the opportunity to share my thoughts with you.
Thank you very much, Vic. It is clear that measuring natural capital values is becoming increasingly important because ecosystem services are large and diverse, and natural capital is gradually more and more damaged. Your presentation also shows that policymakers have to understand that this nature valuation exercise is interdisciplinary. It also requires a good understanding of all the stakeholders involved, as well as a comprehensive analysis of the market and non-market services and goods provided by nature. In your presentation, you also highlighted that this exercise is critical to design other policies such as redistribution policies, new public investments, or how to incentivize the private sector to make choices that do not damage natural resources, for instance. Now, the case for nature valuation is clearer. We also understand that it's not necessarily an easy task. So I would like to now focus on how policymakers can be supported to more systematically integrate this analysis and factor in natural capital in their future decisions. Another point is that in many situations, nature can actually be a solution and not only a critical parameter to take into account. So let me now welcome our third panelist, Yoko Watanabe, who is Director for Environment at the Asian Development Bank. Yoko, you have over 25 years of professional experience working on biodiversity and natural resources management in diverse organizations such as ADB, JEF, the World Bank, JICA, and WWF. Today, could you share with us what nature-based solutions are and how ADB is helping countries to preserve natural capital and implement nature-based solutions? Yoko, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Agnes. And it's such a pleasure to be here with all the panelists and talk about what ADB is trying to do on nature-based solutions and moving forward towards a real climate bank who is addressing both climate and nature issues. So next slide, please. As you can see, that addressing biodiversity and nature loss in Asia and Pacific is really critical. We have achieved economic growth over the years, but this is also in some expenses in the destruction of environment. And we recognize that more than half of the GDP in Asia is actually reliant on natural resources, and nature destruction and exploitation actually is leading to a threat to almost half of the economy of Asia, nearly $19 trillion in stake. So when we are working on as a climate bank at Asian Development Bank, we realize that we really need to work on nature solutions and work on forest, fisheries, ocean, wetlands, and other things as well in order to address climate threats at this point. And we also know that, as Laura mentioned, biodiversity loss is such a critical juncture at this point with mass extinction, and we really need to make concerted efforts. So for the past years, we have been gearing up at the ADB, and particularly with the Global Biodiversity Framework in place, with a global commitment, we are moving forward in full gear to support on the nature-based solution. And what I'll explain is what nature-based solution is as well, and what ADB is doing on this front. Next slide, please. So when we talk about nature-based solution, we are working on a landscape level. We can't be working on a piecemeal basis on a single spaces or a single sort of ecosystem. We need to see things in a more holistic manner. So when we are designing projects, we look at it as a holistic place from the mountain to the sea and the river basin in between, as you see on this map here. And we really look at the root causes and possible solutions. And in the past, in order to address these matters and for development, we came up with more gray engineering solutions, coming up with seawalls or river basin dikes and all those sort of gray engineering we call. But we're also realizing now that green nature-based solutions are equally effective or more effective and sometimes more cost-effective. So for example, what I'm talking about is mangrove and coral can be a very strong climate resilience measures, or working on wetland conservation can be a very good water control and water management solution. So next slide, please. So what we're offering at ADB in terms of working on a programmatic basis on nature-based solution, we are first looking at both policy and project levels. So in terms of the upstream support, we are working with countries, developing countries, our clients, on supporting on the policy dialogue and changes to support more incentivize these nature-based solutions and see what we can do more to encourage both private and public sector to conserve nature and also sustainably use them. And also we provide design clinics, meaning that we provide technical advisory service to improve project design and implementation. And in order to do these work, of course, finance is a major part. So I'll talk a little bit more about it, but we have a finance hub that provides financing to private and public sector to scale up these work in different countries. And finally, it's also very important that we be a knowledge broker by compiling all the best practices and disseminate to internally as well as external sort of partners. And in this regard, I really have to emphasize that with TNC, with Laura's team and others, we are working on the NBSAP development and also supporting the developing countries together, so that the National Biodiversity Action Plan and others can be supported at the policy level. And then in terms of project design, we also have a natural capital lab and a natural capital fund. Like Professor Vic mentioned, we are doing evaluation of natural resources, natural capital, and also assessing those at the country level as well as the product level so that we can really factor in the costs and benefits of the natural resources that we rely on. Next slide, please. So I just wanted to give a snapshot on the ADB projects related to NBS, nature-based solution. There are many different projects that we are working on, and I'll give you also some overview on the type of projects that we're doing and the total expenditure and everything. But as you can see here, we're working on a river basin, we're working on a wetland initiative, coastal resilience and fisheries initiatives, as well as sort of integrated flood risk management and so on. So this is sort of ADB-wide, working on both Asia and Pacific and Central Asia and other areas as well. Next slide, please. So let me actually dive into some of the key examples. So this is about in China. We are working on a so-called sponge city. So this is when we are doing urban development projects. We employ the spawn city concept to reduce flood risk and use forests and wetlands, and also retention of ponds and others to basically regulate the water flow and ensure that there is water supply and a clean water supply towards the city. Next slide, please. In Vietnam, here that you're seeing, this is an example of a rural development project. And this project actually uses bioengineering technique for erosion control to stabilize the roadside slopes and riverbanks. Next slide, please. And then the last project example is from India. And this is actually a coastal protection project, which is combining green and gray infrastructure, as I mentioned earlier as well. So the both uses artificial reefs and beach nutrition and adopt the intensive storm surges from sea level rises. So this is a sort of typical way of using both the traditional gray infrastructure and also nature-based solution to basically adapt to the climate change and really work on flood controls and storm sort of prevention and disaster risk management. Next slide, please. So when we talk about nature-based solution, ADB actually employs the IUCN and UNEP definition that has been agreed upon, and it means that use of nature and its ecosystem services to address development challenges such as environmental degradation, weather-related disaster, and climate change. And this is really considered as an effective tool to address climate change, as well as also have co-benefit towards livelihood and also to biodiversity loss and other major issues. And that kind of stems from a pure sort of more conservation approach with ecosystem restoration and conservation and protection, and towards more mainstreaming into different production sectors like agriculture, fisheries, and also infrastructure related approach, as I mentioned about sort of shifting towards greener infrastructure from a gray conventional infrastructure. Next slide, please. So when we talk about ADB portfolio, we have around $7 billion and 40 projects nearly in terms of our current investment is concerned. And many of the projects are in East Asia, as you can see. And there is a really increased interest from the countries and the developing countries that we work with. And you can see all the countries that are involved in right now, and these are expanding portfolio. Next slide, please. In terms of sector is concerned, agriculture and natural resource sector is about 55%, and this is the largest portfolio we have, followed by transport sector, which is working on more green infrastructure, including having overpass for railways in Bangladesh, to having also an underpass in Nepal for the East-West Highway. All these type of projects that we're working with transport to make it more nature-based. Next slide, please. Maybe click again. So now I wanted to introduce that now we are really trying to scale up this intervention on nature-based solution. And in COP28 in Dubai last year, we have announced that ADB launching the new Nature Solutions Finance Hub for Asia and Pacific. And we're working with partners to now start implementation of this facility. Could you click a few times? Yes. So going back. So the vision is really to establish an innovative finance platform to support our developing countries, partners, and also private sectors to really scale up the investment on the ground. So we're going to sort of cloud in both public and private sector finance to support these initiatives moving forward. And we have a $5 billion ambition for capital flows into NBS projects. And this will be also supporting innovative private sector projects as well as country level projects with the governments and civil society and others. Next slide, please. So the vision of this Nature Solution Finance Hub is to really scale up these finance and also de-risk these finance so that there is more incentive to work on these work and also incubate new ideas and innovation moving forward. And we're using quite a bit of innovative finance, which I might able to discuss a little bit more, with using bonds and credits and also debt for nature swap and other modality moving forward. I think that's the end of it. So hope you got the sense of how ADB is moving forward and investing more on the nature-based solutions and working with partners like TNC here and many other INGOs and also financing partners so that we can scale up our work moving forward. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Yoko, for sharing these excellent examples, and also this Nature Solutions Finance Hub for Asia and Pacific is indeed a great innovation. We have now a few minutes left for additional discussion, so I would like to turn to Vic. Vic, in your presentation, you briefly explained how to translate the valuation exercise into policy instruments, such as a compensation mechanism, for instance. Could you share with us a concrete example of a country that has done this so that we further understand the process?
Sure. I mean, one of the oldest, and it's in the United States, is actually the Conservation Reserve Program that is a fund to take highly sensitive land out of agricultural production and turn it into less intense production that generates ecosystem services of water quality, of carbon sequestration, a host of other activities. They periodically evaluate the financial benefits, the market and non-market benefits of those investments. And that's what generates the continuing investment in that conservation program. These are effectively payments for ecosystem services to agricultural landowners, where those payments are rationalized, if you will, by the values of natural assets and ecosystem services that are created from the investments. So it's an example that's been ongoing for decades. And I think it's a very good one globally for us to learn, as they have a great deal of experience, not only of implementing the program, but of evaluating the market and non-market benefits of the program.
Indeed, this is a very good example. Thanks for sharing this. Now turning to Laura and Yoko, you both, in your presentations, you both refer to finance and financial tools as key elements, of course. Could you elaborate a bit more on the financial instruments available to support the 30 by 30 target, Laura? And Yoko, after Laura, could you elaborate more on the financial instruments made available through the hub, please? Let's start with Laura. Laura, over to you.
Sure, thank you. Yeah, so finance is critical, and I feel like we've heard that from Vic and Yoko as well. And I think something important to underscore is that, you know, even though the GBF target number 19 calls for a tripling of overseas assistance to support the delivery of the GBF, so taking that up to 30 billion a year by 2030, it's important to keep in mind that actually the vast majority of new financing to deliver on these commitments is going to come from domestic resources. And so that's going to be the case even in developing countries. So with that in mind, you know, we consider that national biodiversity finance plans are really critical and provide, you know, an integrated way to align domestic financing approaches, and again looking for those synergies between biodiversity and climate, as we talked about, and opportunities in particular to support nature-based solutions. Another thing I might just quickly mention is Nature Bonds, which is a program of TNCs that really includes three aspects. So one is debt refinancing. So this is about working together with countries to refinance their sovereign debt. But as part of that, they're making a conservation commitment and establishing a conservation trust fund in order to support ongoing management in order to operationalize their commitments. So TNC is really proud of the work that we've been able to do in that space. We've so far finalized 4 blue bonds. So in the Seychelles, Belize, Barbados, and Gabon, none yet in Asia Pacific, but we're eagerly looking for potential opportunities to do that. And so far, those projects have unlocked a total of over $400 million, which is really exciting. The other thing I might just very quickly mention is project finance for permanence. And so TNC is working together with other partners, including WWF, Pew and Zoma Lab, on a partnership called Enduring Earth, which is all about delivering permanent conservation at scale. And it's through these PFPs. And so these are really intended to be transformative agreements, so that bring all of the relevant stakeholders to the table, communities, governments, a variety of different relevant stakeholders, in thinking about what are the full funding needs for conservation in perpetuity of a particular area, and then working together to put in place changes in policy, changes in practices, as well as funding, and doing that all in a single close. So kind of coming to that agreement in a single moment. And TNC is currently working together with partners on one in Mongolia that's looking to deliver, for example, protections, improved management, sustainable livelihoods for more than 20,000 households. It's a really interesting approach, I think, to this financing question, and one, again, that we're keen to roll out in other geographies. I'm sure Yoko will have much to add on the question of finance, so I might hand over to her. Thank you.
Thank you, Laura. Yoko, yes, over to you.
Great. Laura have covered quite extensively already on those matters, so I'll be just quick considering time. But in terms of the Nature Solutions Finance Hub that we have launched and starting up, we're thinking of 3-4 concrete financial instruments. One is, first of all, the support to make these projects bankable. So capital expenditure, operational expenditure support towards private sector as well as government, and make sure that there is sort of a de-risking element to incentivize and increase those projects. And the concrete ones in terms of innovative financing, Laura already mentioned, but building on the experience of TNC and many others, we are also, in a very strong space in ADB on the blue bonds and the green bonds and different thematic bonds. So the nature bonds and credit comes in very strong in terms of potential finance instruments, particularly in terms of credit enhancement, and incentivizes nature credits. Finally, we also feel that the debt for nature swap is really an interesting modality that we can learn from Latin America and others. And these are really proven as a useful sort of tool to decrease debt reduction and exchange those with investment for nature. And so in Asia and Pacific, I think there are a couple of countries, there are opportunities, and we're working with different countries like Mongolia and others, as Laura have also mentioned. But finally, we are also trying to work, of course, with the government itself, as it's really important that the national expenditure really move towards nature and understand the natural capital of the countries for further investment and further growth. So in that regard, the National Biodiversity Action Plan, as well as other strategies and policy support is really important. So we are also working on policy lending programs. Philippines and others are considering the first biodiversity policy lending programs. And I really think that those will be a very useful instruments moving forward. So Over back to you, Agnes.
Thank you, Yoko. I can see that Sing Chung Beck has a question. Deputy Dean Beck, would you like to take the floor?
We have time.
Just
okay.
if you can be quick. Yes, we have time.
Yeah. Thank you very much for your valuable presentation. Let me ask a question to Dr. Vic. In your conclusion part of your presentation, you mentioned that measuring value of natural capital can identify this distribution concerns. So may I ask, what do you mean by the distribution concerns? Kind of the economic distribution also included in this distribution concerns, like income distribution. Okay.
Right. I'm thinking about the distribution of the benefits from the ecosystem services or from the investments that are being made. So who is it? Is it indigenous communities that would benefit primarily from these investments? Is it other individuals? Can we examine perhaps it's lower income individuals that would benefit from these investments? I think that notion of who is actually benefiting from investments is an important piece of the policy decision-making toolkit. I think that really helps us address equity concerns with these kinds of investments. And as much as Laura was outlining in her comments about the importance of equity as part of the policy toolkit, I would say this valuation is one of the ways to make some descriptions of what those impacts might be.
I see. Thank you very much. And I have another question to Dr. Rora. In your presentation, you mentioned that as one of the opportunities of kind of the action plan, NBSAP, you mentioned that it can contribute to the gender equity. So could you please elaborate some more detailed about how it works for the gender equity? The action plan can contribute to addressing kind of gender inequality.
Yeah, happy to. And it's a great question. And I think my response also really builds on Vic's comments just now about just needing to foreground consideration of the beneficiaries of any of this work. And we know there's a lot of evidence to suggest that unless we're applying a gender lens specifically, that typically women stand not to benefit in the same way as men do. And there's a lot of evidence about that. And so the way that we can address that is by putting that gender lens on the analysis from the outset, including, gender specific analyses to work out, different, who has access to resources, what are the barriers to that access, and just making sure that all of these investments are gender responsive rather than gender blind, which has historically, unfortunately, been the case.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Laura.
Agnes. Yeah.
Thank you very much. And indeed, it's a good opportunity to further put the emphasis on the importance of equity in this agenda. So it's now time to close this episode. I want to sincerely thank our panelists for sharing knowledge as well as experiences so that policymakers can better understand what the tools and solutions available to stop natural capital degradation are. Before closing this session, let me share with you my key takeaways. Factoring in the necessity to stop natural capital degradation is no longer an option for policymakers. It's an urgency with many positive spillover benefits impacting economies and societies. We have now a precious global policy framework which was adopted in 2022 with the 30 by 30 target. This should be a key starting point for all policymakers, and NBSAPs are also critical from this perspective. To preserve nature, undertaking a valuation exercise in monetary units is critical to inform adequate regulation and select investments, but it's not easy as several parameters have to be taken into account. And we briefly went through the steps that have to be taken. Then this nature evaluation has to be translated into policy instruments. Policymakers have several options, such as compensation mechanism, for instance. As this phase is not easy, we also saw that policymakers can be supported and they can get help from a variety of actors, including multilateral development banks such as ADB. Financial instruments are available. We covered nature bonds, national facilities or funds, debt for nature swaps, project finance for permanence, and de-risking instruments. So these are very important instruments policymakers can tap on. Finally, nature can be the solution, and nature-based solutions are available. And we also saw that many institutions such as ADB can also help scaling up these solutions. Thank you again for joining episode 4 of the webinar series on the economics of climate change. The recording will be uploaded to the event webpage shortly. Please also take a few moments to complete our post-event survey. Have a wonderful day, and we look forward to welcoming you to the following episodes and future ADBI events. See you soon.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.